6 weeks in the books, and the college football season is just about halfway through. For the first time since August, Virginia Tech football will have the weekend off, but it's still the 3304 Sports Kickoff Show bye-week edition. Joined alongside Raza, Umerani, and Giovanni Heater, I'm Braden Schenck. So glad you can be with us. Guys, it feels like just yesterday Virginia Tech was kicking off the season at Vanderbilt.
Yeah, no doubt about it. It feels like in a lot of ways, maybe not the season that many people expected, but I think the fun part is it's still all right in front of you, right? You're 3-3 at this point, but you got a lot of football left to be played, and this is a team that didn't play a lot of conference games early on, so they got a lot of ACC matchups coming up.
Yeah, time absolutely flies, Braden, because I remember week one, you and I were on this desk up here together, and then I went and joined Gio in Nashville for his 21st birthday, and that was a good time. I mean, Virginia Tech, one of only a few FBS teams to play 6 times in 6 weeks, so this is a much-needed bye, especially after 2 long road trips, so definitely a much-needed bye week for all of us.
And I want to go back to last week for a second. Virginia Tech takes the long road trip to California, takes down Stanford, moves to 3-3 on the season. What'd you like out of the Hokies on the West Coast?
You know, I thought that it was arguably the best game they've played under Brent Pry, kind of in a vacuum in terms of the way that they controlled the ball on offense, played good defense, forced 2 turnovers while not committing any. They ran the ball very workmanlike. 3.8 yards per carry is not going to blow anybody away, but they just were able to chip away, run the ball just as effectively as they needed to. And my main takeaway when I was there is that's how Tech is supposed to look against a team that is not very good. Stanford has a good win over Syracuse, maybe better than we expected, but still not a very good football team. I think that's how Tech is supposed to look against the teams that they're supposed to beat.
Felt in a lot of ways like when Virginia Tech took down Boston College, Pitt, Wake Forest last year, especially when they went on that run and started to catch their stride, Braden. What I like the most is that they played their strongest offensive identity so far this season. It felt like in some ways they got away from that at the beginning of the year, but what do I mean by that? 36 times Virginia Tech ran the ball to just 19 passing attempts. That's the identity of this team.
Right.
Rely on Bashal Tutin, 33 in maroon and orange. Rely on Kyron Drones to run the football. I mean, Virginia Tech only threw it 19 times, and then they were averaging over 10 yards per passing attempt. That means that they were playing incredibly efficient when they were throwing the football. All across the board, it just allowed Kyron Drones to look a lot more comfortable, a lot more confident in his role as the starting quarterback. This is the best they've looked offensively.
And obviously the last 2 weeks have been very good for Virginia Tech. You can't quite pull one out at Miami, but you play good football. You get the win at Stanford. Then you throw a bye in there. How does this bye kind of affect the momentum of Virginia Tech?
I think the momentum is going to be fine. Like I said, I think it's much-needed rest after 2 very long road trips, including the longest road trip in the history of the program in the regular season. In terms of the momentum, though, I think that, like you mentioned, Braden, they didn't pull out the win in Miami, but until that point, that was the best football they had played all year. And then last week at Stanford, you can say maybe that is the best football they've played all year. So they're trending in the right direction, and the bye will only kind of keep that snowball rolling. So I think that the Virginia Tech team we've seen the last 2 weeks will go out there, or could go out there, and beat Boston College and Georgia Tech in the coming weeks.
I mean, how often do you say this? But I think the bye is coming at the perfect time.
Right.
Granted, if it happened 2 weeks from now, we'd probably say that. In 2 weeks prior, we might be saying the same thing. But I think it's true, and I think it's because of how that Miami game went. The worst thing you could have done is had to sit on that through an entire bye week. Instead, this team had the opportunity to go out and play ticked off, go out west to Stanford, take care of business, and now you get to build off of that, to your point, snowball off that. But I think the biggest thing about this bye week, it goes down to your best player, which is Bashal Tutin, your running back that I go back to again, because he's playing with that banged-up knee. He's had a brace on his knee since week 3 of the season now to this point. I mean, situations where at Miami he's got a big 55-yarder and then he's kind of limping in the end zone at the end of that run. I mean, he's a dog, right? He's playing a different level of football, and he's doing it injured. Now you're in a situation, he has a bye week. So theoretically, besides the season opener, he should be going into this Boston College game healthier than he's been since the beginning of the year. And then, on top of it, you have 10 days rest because you're playing Thursday. Then you don't play Georgia Tech till a Saturday. So you should have Tutin's most healthy games coming up against Boston College and Georgia Tech, and he's your biggest weapon.
Well, a lot to smile for if you're a Virginia Tech fan. And 2024 has been a year of firsts. I mean, the Hokies going to the West Coast for the first time, headlined by the new 12-team playoff. But there's been this rapid change in conference realignment that's plagued almost every conference in the country. And to tell us more, Kyle Marchak is going to explain how the ACC's recent additions of SMU, Cal, and Stanford has impacted the conference.
2,381. That's how many miles there are between Blacksburg, Virginia, and Stanford, California. 2 years ago, if you told me that that would be the longest trip Virginia Tech football would be taking in 2024, I'd ask you if you had your coffee this morning. But it's real, folks. The Hokies just flew 5 hours cross country and played a conference game in Stanford Stadium. Conference realignment is here. Stanford has come along with the additions of Cal, just up the road in Berkeley, here on the California coast, and then Southern Methodist University down in Dallas, Texas. Ah, yes, the Atlantic Coast Conference. All right, we're halfway through the season, so let's catch up on how these new ACC insertions have played out thus far. Well, let's start with Stanford. They're Stanford, I guess. They started with a strong 2-1 record and a successful ACC debut with a win in Syracuse, but their starting play caller Ashton Daniels is out with a foot injury, and the Cardinal did not impress with backup Justin Lampson against the Hokies this past week. That's football for you, but Stanford still brings the pedigree of being one of the finest academic institutions in the country and one of the most decorated athletically, with 123 championships in their 139 years of existence. Cal Berkeley, on the other hand, well, they're also smart in the classroom and on the gridiron. They're 3-2 this year with a pretty high strength of schedule, and they took number 6 Miami down to the wire at home last week with College Game Day in attendance. So how about that? College Game Day visiting well-known ACC school Cal. What a world we live in. But on the gridiron, SMU has been the most impressive addition to the Atlantic Coast Conference. The Mustangs are 5-1 with their only loss coming from a 14th ranked BYU squad back in week 3. And all right, can I go on a quick tangent here? Just a geography nitpick. Technically, SMU geographically is closer to the Atlantic Ocean than Blacksburg is to the Atlantic Ocean. Their campus is closer by a couple of hours. If you drive 240 miles southeast of Dallas, you get to the Atlantic Ocean. 5 hours from Blacksburg. Just saying. So take that, geography nerds. All right, so the new ACC schools are better at football than anticipated this year and more Atlantic than some of you might have thought. Just some food for thought. Not too shabby, ACC. Not too shabby. Guys?
Thank you, Kyle. So, guys, I want to look at this Virginia Tech team now as a whole. I mean, it's fitting that we're 6 weeks in, halfway through the season, kind of a mid-season report card, if you will. I'll throw you guys a topic, and I want to hear a letter grade for what you would give that for the first half of the season. So we'll get started with QB1 then. Kyron Drones, what have you thought of Drones' performance for the first 6 weeks?
I'd give it a C+ at this point, and I don't think it's entirely his fault by any stretch of the imagination. Virginia Tech threw it 33 times against Miami when that run game was working.
Yeah.
Right? You had the 55-yard gash by Bajal Tutin, but on top of that, it was working across the board. They were averaging over 4 yards a carry at that point. Things were cooking on the offensive side of the football. You didn't really have to throw. There were some situations where maybe you felt like you wish they had ran the football instead of throwing. I take you to that 3rd down and 3. They end up not getting it because they throw it incomplete. Then they go the fake field goal. All of a sudden, that changes the game because you come away empty. Maybe if you run the ball, results are a little bit different. He threw it just 19 times, like we had mentioned earlier last week against Stanford, and it really worked. He's shown some big playability, though. I mean, that 4th quarter play, rolling out to his right, facing pressure, panic mode. You're like, no, no, no. Throws it middle of the end zone. Aiden Green's there, and you're like, yes, yes, yes. Looked like Patrick Mahomes on that play. He's missed some deep shots, struggled to hook up with Quan Felton until this Stanford game where they gash him for a long one down the field. But that was, again, on a kind of a slant route. He puts it in the perfect spot, but he's missed on a lot of those long balls. Again, I don't think it's entirely his fault. I think in the last 2 weeks, he's more of a B. But encompassing the entire season, I give it a C+.
Just kind of piggybacking off of that, I was going to say if we were having this conversation 2-3 weeks ago, I think the answer would be maybe a lot harsher. But I'm going to go with B- for KD1. You know, he mentioned to me on Saturday in Palo Alto that he wasn't feeling like himself in the first 4 weeks of the season. I think it perfectly complements what Gio said about the team's offensive identity. Maybe they were asking him to do too much. He said he was trying to do too much. Now he's kind of back to being the Kyron Drones that we saw in the last 8 or 9 weeks of last year. And, you know, I'm really happy you brought up Daquan Felton because he brought up that connection specifically. He was like, we had this great connection last year, especially on those deep shots, and they were wondering, where has that gone? Well, they've kind of found that now, and if they can keep that going in the coming weeks, I think it's only going to make Kyron more comfortable, and I think that he's only going to improve as the season goes along. But, I mean, he has over 1,000 passing yards, 8 passing touchdowns, and nearly 300 rushing yards and 3 rushing touchdowns. So it's about the stats we expect out of Kyron, but his play is improving on a week-to-week basis, so I'm going to go B- for the quarterback.
That's the offense, and there was so much talk earlier in the season about the defense, kind of the inconsistency to play 2 full halves. But now looking at this Virginia Tech defense, how would you rate that?
I'm going to go with a C, just perfectly down the middle, and there's a reason for that. Virginia Tech has the 2nd best passing defense in the ACC, which is about what we would expect from a secondary featuring guys like Dorian Strong and Mansour Delane, future NFL cornerbacks. However, Tech has the 2nd worst rushing defense in the ACC. And that is exactly what you wanted to avoid after last year when you brought in all these transfers, Sam Brumfield, Aeneas Peebles, all those guys to plug in the inside. And yeah, Peebles has been great, and obviously like APR and even Kelvin Gilliam, another transfer, have been really big bright spots. But when you try to plug the middle of the defense in order to be better against the run and you still can't stop the run, that's a failure. But if you're so good against the pass that nobody can throw the ball against you, that's a great success. So I think a C right down the middle is the perfect grade you can give this Virginia Tech defense.
Yeah, I'm going to rank them just a little bit higher. I give them a B as far as their defense goes. I think it's the strength of the team. That's kind of the core, the foundation. That's what Virginia Tech historically has prided itself on, is suffocating defense. And I think the perfect way to describe this unit this season is a true bend but don't break with, with a sprinkle of havoc. A sprinkle of havoc, right? The Hokies have forced 4 turnovers inside their own 6-yard line in the last 3 weeks. Not to mention the 4th down stop on the goal line against Rutgers as well. I mean, these are game-changing havoc plays, and you lead off of that and talk about how they lead the ACC in sacks with 20, tied with Miami. It's hard not to talk about that havoc. That being said, you can't always let them get inside the red zone. You can't always let them get inside the 6-yard line and then force that turnover, right? I give it a B.
Okay, well then our third topic of debate here, Virginia Tech, a lot of preseason hype coming into this year. Some people were saying this could be the greatest Virginia Tech team in recent memory. You lose week 1 at Vanderbilt and you're 3-3 at the midseason point. How has Virginia Tech lived up to that preseason hype or not?
I give it an F. And that's only because of how lofty the expectations were. This is less of a knock on Virginia Tech and more a knock on the national media, but I will say, Brent Pry at ACC Kickoff, head coach of Virginia Tech football, he said that they would be disappointed if they did not win an ACC championship.
That's right.
The head coach set that foundation, set that expectation, right? The national media kind of spiraled off of that. They were talking about it before. They piggybacked afterwards, but there was playoff hype. I mean, you had some big figures across the country putting Virginia Tech in the playoff, putting them in a position to win the ACC, talking about Kyron Drones as a Heisman dark horse. Well, that all evaporated rather quickly in a steamy Saturday afternoon in Nashville when the Hokies started 0-1.
You can mark this date in history. For the first time, Giovanni Heater and I agree on something. Wow. I am going to also give the Hokies an F in this regard, just because, like Gio mentioned, they were expected to be 5-1, if not 6-0 at this point. Kyron Drones Heisman talk, Virginia Tech ACC champs, or even an at-large playoff berth was on the table for this team. And listen, Vanderbilt just went out and beat Alabama, so maybe they're not the pushover that we expected at the beginning of the season. Rutgers is never a pushover with the physical style of play that they have, in Piscataway, New Jersey. But Virginia Tech was not supposed to lose either of those 2 games. And even in a vacuum, they weren't supposed to, because they were favorites in both of those games. So Virginia Tech has just not lived up to those lofty expectations. I mean, even if they were lofty, right? You were just saying that this team returned all those starters and all that production, and it's a team that's kind of in the same place through 6 games as they were last year. It's a big fat F in my regard.
I think one thing's known is with 3 topics, and you guys are very harsh graders. I think we're lucky this is just the midterm. Who knows what the final exam looks like with Professor Heater and Professor Umerani?
Oh, if it's anything like last year, the final exam could be a B+, or if not better, I mean, this team has the capability to go on a run like we'll talk about.
And it all starts with the coaching, I would argue. Brent Pry, coordinators Chris Marv, Tyler Bowen. What have you seen out of the coaching through the first 6 weeks?
I'm not going to get much nicer here, Braden. I'm going to give the coaching a D+, and there's a very, very big reason for that. In some classes, it might be a passing grade. You know what they say, D's get degrees, right? So the big reason for me is that coaching decisions have cost Virginia Tech arguably 2 wins, right? Virginia Tech could be 5-1, like I mentioned, if they had coached better at Vanderbilt and at Miami, right? In the first 3 weeks of the season, there were coaching mishaps on special teams every single week, namely in Vanderbilt, the 2 number zeros on the punt that gave Vanderbilt another opportunity to kick a field goal, which, of course they boomed through. And then at the end of the game, when Vanderbilt missed that field goal, that could have been the kick to tie the game. And if they missed it, Virginia Tech would have won it. Instead, that was the kick to win the game. They missed it. The game went to overtime, and Vanderbilt won, obviously. And then you mentioned the fake field goal. I don't even hate that decision, Gio. We've talked about that ad nauseum at this point, but the clock management at the end of the first half, and even at the end of the second half when Virginia Tech was driving down the field, leading to the Hail Mary, Fail Mary, whatever you want to call it. So I just think that coaching decisions have really cost Virginia Tech in big, big moments, and it could have covered up games that ended up being losses, but because we can pinpoint specific decisions that have lost Virginia Tech games, they can't get anything higher than a D+.
Yeah, I give it a C-, and the only reason is why, because who are we? We are, let's realistically look in the
Yes.
mirror. We're students.
Yes.
These are grown men that know what they're doing, very experienced, and you love them, right? Brent Pry, that's his strength, is hugging babies and taking pictures, and not that he can't coach football. Tremendous football coach as well, but he's a guy that the fan base has fallen in love with. And for that, it's a little bit hard to grade him any lower than a C-. But this coaching staff has held the team back. I think it goes to the inconsistency offensively, right? They kind of strayed away from their offensive identity that got them on that run and got them back to a bowl game last season. And they didn't look quite the same throughout the beginning like we've talked about. And just to piggyback, the poor clock management cost you 3 points at Miami, right? You had a situation where if you bleed the clock down, call a timeout with 2-3 seconds, kick the long field goal. John Love, shout out, 57-yarder. Very impressive. Pat McAfee would love something like that. But if you do that, you go into the locker room happy, you're up 10 points.
Right.
Instead, Virginia Tech, Brent Pry even admitted he kind of panicked because Kyron Drones takes a sack. He calls a timeout with 25 seconds left. You kick the field goal, but then you squib kick it. You give Miami midfield position. Next thing you know, they kick a field goal, and, well, it's a 7-point game at halftime on the road instead of a 10-point game. And that was a huge difference considering how that ball game ended. So, again, just going off of Raza's point, the coaching decisions have cost this team a couple of times. Plus the numbers, the double numbers, it happened again. Happened again.
Against Miami. It's inexcusable. And there was a video, like a staffer on the sideline realized it, but then Brent Pry said, not after the game because there were more important questions to ask after Miami, but in his next weekly press conference, he was like, that call is missed more times than it's called. So, like, who knows how many times it has happened in the past or is going to happen in the future, but it is rather inexcusable.
I guess just the final thing I'm going to toss up to you here. Again, 6 weeks in the books, 6 more games for Virginia Tech. True midseason point. How would you rate the overall team performance through the first 6 games?
Listen, they're 3-3. That's down the middle. So I'm going to stay down the middle and just give them a C. I think it could be lower, again, based on the expectations. But if we're just looking at this Virginia Tech team in a vacuum, it's a team that is really good at running the ball and really good at stopping the pass. They're not great at throwing the ball, and they're pretty bad against the run in terms of their defense. Now, that being said, their defensive line is great at getting after the passer, as Gio mentioned, with all those sack numbers, and Antoine Powell-Ryland has been an absolute monster, just as he was last year. But they kind of just need to keep putting together complete performances for me to put more faith in them. If they look like they did against Stanford every week, that's an A-plus team all around. But you're not playing Stanford every week. The ACC is tough, it's deep, and it's not going to be easy from here on out, especially with teams against games against teams as good as Clemson or as frisky as Boston College, Georgia Tech, or Syracuse up in the Dome. So I think that there's room to improve, but right now it's a C for me.
Yeah, I'll keep it brief. I give it a C+. Pretty much on the same level with Raza here, though. And I think the plus comes from the fact that they've shown a lot of improvements the last 2 weeks, particularly against Stanford. But hey, you go on the road, Hard Rock Stadium, playing a top 10 team in the country against Miami. I mean, Friday night lights, the eyes of the nation fixated on Miami Gardens, and you ball out in a lot of ways, right? You could go back and nitpick, and of course, hindsight's 2020. Ooh, maybe I wish we ran the ball a little bit more instead of passing it 33 times or this and that. But at the end of the day, I mean, you were playing a Heisman contending quarterback, picked him off in the red zone twice, put yourself in a position to win the game multiple times, controlled the scoring deficit for a lot of that ball game, played ahead a lot of that game. That was impressive in itself, even though that they didn't come out with a win. I give it a C+.
Well, that's your midseason report for Giovanni Heater and Raza Umerani. Put those report cards up on the refrigerator, maybe throw them in the trash. I don't know. But hey, it's never too early to start thinking about the college football playoff. And to tell us more about ACC teams looking to grab that Willy Wonka golden ticket to the CFB playoff, here's Key McCrimmon.
With the 12-team expansion for college football playoffs in its first year, the opportunity to get into the playoffs has never been greater. And since we're in Blacksburg, let's look at the ACC teams that have a shot to get into the college football playoff. To start with the obvious, the Miami Hurricanes. They're currently 6-0 in the year, and their offense puts on the show every week. They average 47 points and 583 total yards a game. Quarterback Cam Ward's putting on a Heisman campaign like none other, and he has 20 touchdowns through the air and has formed a deadly connection with wide receiver Xavier Restrepo. On top of that, they have a three-headed monster in the backfield with Damian Martinez, Jordan Lyle, and Mark Fletcher Jr. You never know which one of them can pop off and have a big game. Miami is coming off 2 come-from-behind victories with some controversy in both games, but the Canes are number 6 in the nation and still have to face some good teams. But they're still seen as heavy favorites to get the ACC automatic bid into the college football playoffs. Moving on to a team that can easily make the ACC title game, the Clemson Tigers. They started the season getting dismantled by Georgia, but since then they've won 4 straight games and they've averaged 49 points in those 4 games. Kate Klubnik may not have as many yards as Cam Ward, but he's still taking care of the ball effectively with a 7-to-1 touchdown interception ratio. Another huge part of Clemson's offense has been running back Phil Maffa, who has 500 rushing yards and averages 7 yards a carry. The Tigers are currently 10th in the nation and have fun November games coming up against Louisville, Virginia Tech, and Pitt as they hope to continue their possibility run and to get into the playoffs. Speaking of Pitt, let's talk about them real quick. One of the more surprising teams this season, the Panthers are 5-0, and all of it has been on the shoulders of Eli Holstein, the transfer quarterback from Alabama. He has 15 touchdowns through the air and 3 on the ground, and currently has Pittsburgh at number 22 in the nation. He continues to make plays and make the players around him better, like halfback Desmond Reed and wide receiver Konata Mumfield, who averages nearly 20 yards per reception. They may slow down as they face a tough Syracuse team, number 10 Clemson, as I mentioned, and the last ACC team with playoff hopes, SMU, to finish off their schedule. Southern Methodist University's first year in the ACC has been strong. They're 25th in the nation after an upset win at Louisville. Ever since head coach Rhett Lashley made the change to start backup quarterback Kevin Jennings in Week 3, the Mustangs' offense has been looking sharp, especially running the ball. They average 203 yards on the ground. Also, they have a favorable schedule coming up when they host Pitt in Week 8. So mark your calendars on November 2nd when Pitt travels to SMU in a game with huge conference implications. The regular season is halfway through. It's Week 7. It's hard to say who will be in the playoffs right now, but if my New York Mets taught me anything, anyone could get into the postseason, and it will be fun to see how the rest of 2024 plays out. Guys?
Thank you, Key. Let's take a broader look now around the country. 6 weeks in the books, as I mentioned. Let's highlight some individual and team awards in our midseason awards, you could say. We'll start with our first award. Which team's been a sleeper in the country that's kind of shocked the world, and which team has shocked you for kind of underperforming this year?
Well, one of those is a very easy answer, and I'll get to that in a second. But my sleeper team that's kind of shocked the world, how about the Indiana Hoosiers? Indiana was picked to finish 17th in an 18-team Big Ten. They're currently tied for first, 6-0, 3-0 in the Big Ten. They're 6-0 for the first time since 1967. My dad was 2 years old. Their quarterback, Ohio transfer Curtis Rourke, has been an electric factory, one of the most prolific passers in the country. They have a top 3 scoring offense and a top 15 scoring defense. Like, this is a very, very good team in the Big Ten that could be really frisky. So watch out for the Indiana Hoosiers. But, I mean, come on, easy answer. Underperformer of the year has got to be Florida State. Preseason number 10, picked to repeat to win the ACC. They were like, oh, we got left out of the playoff. We're going to be out for revenge. They're 1-5 this year. That's just, and their one win was, they barely escaped beating Cal at home. So DJ Uyunglele was a big disappointment, and now he's probably out for the year. They have one of the most anemic offenses, not just in the ACC, but in the country. So Florida State is, their season is chalked. They're probably not making a bowl game. And they were talking about how they should have gotten in the college football playoff last year. So that's an easy answer for me in terms of an underperformer.
Yeah, just to keep things a little bit different, I'm going to go BYU as my sleeper team. They're
Oops.
off to a 5-0 start, 2-0 in Big 12 play. This was a team that, very similar to Indiana, was picked to finish 13th in the Big 12. They currently sit at second. Huge ranked wins over then 13th ranked Kansas State. They also beat a now ranked SMU team as well. Jake Retzlaff, he's kind of a dual threat monster playing quarterback for them. I will say this, though. Don't sleep on Army and Navy.
Yeah.
Don't sleep on Army and Navy as being some sleeper teams maybe for this whole college football playoff thing. Going to the biggest disappointment, I think there were a handful of teams. Florida State was the obvious one.
Right.
And again, for keeping the sake of differency here, Oklahoma State was a little bit disappointed. I think Kansas, similar to that in the Big 12. But my biggest disappointment, really, and maybe because we're a little biased, we're an ACC country, it's been NC State. Many thought that they'd be a team that was ready to compete in the ACC. I mean, you're talking about a team that won 9 games in the regular season a season ago, but they've been blown out by Tennessee, blown out by Clemson, and that just kind of shows that they're not even close to playing in the same ballpark at this point. I think Grayson McCall has not translated quite strongly to the Power 4 level. It's fair to say. I hope his health is in good case because he got pretty banged up, took a big hit last week, and things were a little scary, got stretchered off the field. So they're going to be without him for at least this week against Syracuse. We'll see going forward. So again, we're hoping for him, and we're praying for him. But NC State, just to kind of have a stat to back it up, possesses the worst scoring defense in the ACC. The Wolfpack just haven't put it all together this year.
Makes sense. Now we'll go to one of our player awards here. How about the Heisman Award through weeks 1 through 6? Just looking at the stats of the first half of the season, who are you giving your first half Heisman to?
Heisman! Who you got, Raza?
Again, I think this is an easy answer. How about Ashton Genty, Boise State? Listen, we were high on him coming into the year, but I don't think anybody saw this coming. I'm just going to read off the numbers real quick. 95 carries, 1,031 yards, 16 touchdowns, 10.9 yards per carry, Giovanni Heater. He's on pace for for nearly 2,500 yards and 38 touchdowns. Now, obviously, that's not going to happen. But, I mean, historic season thus far, historic pace. He's put up those numbers despite, like, being pulled in third quarters and fourth quarters and second halves of games. It doesn't matter that he's playing in the group of five. He has been the best player in college football.
Think about what these kind of litmus tests, these big markers are. 10 sacks, a double-digit sack season, 1,000-yard rusher. We've played, 5, 6 games, and he's already well over 1,000 yards. It's absolutely unbelievable. He is the runaway at this point. And how beautiful of a sport is this? Like, people want to talk about 2007, a chaotic season, right? Are we going to get that kind of a year when we go into this 12-team playoff? I think having a group of 5 Heisman running back would be the most 2007 thing ever. This is kind of an award that's turned more into a quarterback award, right? You get a little bit of Devonta Smith sprinkled in there, but go on to the days of your running backs being the workhorses, not with Ashton Jeanty for Boise State. But again, for the sake of keeping it different, I would love to see Travis Hunter win this thing. And I think Jeanty's the runaway favorite, but what impresses me so much about Travis Hunter is that he does it on both sides. And you don't see that often. And it's not like, okay, he's a pretty good receiver and an elite defender, or vice versa. No, he is arguably one of the best at his position, both offensively and defensively, and he's changing games. I mean, he's scoring touchdowns that are winning them games. He is also making defensive plays like forced fumbles at the end of the game on the goal line and diving interceptions that are winning Colorado football games. And now the Buffs look like maybe, just maybe, they got a big one this weekend against Kansas State. They might actually be ready for prime time. And they might be ready to compete. And Travis Hunter's a huge reason as to why.
I mean, the stats speak alone. They're video game numbers. If I was actually good at the college football video game, which I'm not, but they are numbers to say the least. And now let's look at the coaching side a little bit. Obviously, a lot of new faces in the game this year on the coaching side. But which coach potentially has made the biggest splash, or just overall as your coach of the first half?
I'm going to go back to Bloomington. Sorry, Gio.
No, you're good.
Again, Indiana 6-0, and it's all under first-year head coach Curt Cignetti, who came over from JMU here in the Commonwealth. Again, they were picked to finish 17th, and they're currently tied for first. He brought in a lot of his most productive offensive guys from JMU, and like I said, brought in Curtis Rourke as well. So he's worked the transfer portal, like a first-year head coach would, not necessarily like Coach Prime would, but, not many people are bringing in 100 new players every year. They're very effective on both sides of the ball. They have a lot of good wins already under their belt. I mean, they went out west and absolutely throttled UCLA. Nobody saw that one coming. So I got to go Curt Cignetti. He deserves his flowers. I mean, what did he say? Wherever I go, I win. You should Google me or something like that. So
crazy.
Nobody needs Google anymore. Curt Cignetti has made it.
Crazy quote right there. Yeah, I'm going to give it to Fran Brown as well for Syracuse, right? I mean, Syracuse off to a hot start. They have 2 ranked wins under their belt. Beat Georgia Tech when they were ranked. Beat UNLV on the road when they were ranked. Nice test coming up against NC State on the road. Less because of the team, but more because that's going to be a very tough place to play. Raleigh always is. Carter Finley always gets rocking, especially a night game, 8 p.m. Saturday night on the ACC network. But what's been most impressive is his ability to overhaul the roster like that. I mean, he was tabbed as the most elite recruiter in the country when he was hired. That's why he was hired, going from a DB's coach to the head coach of a Power 4 program. Plain and simple was his ability to recruit, and he's done just that. I mean, he brought in Kyle McCord. He's also brought in a ton of different pieces around him, brought some guys, Zeed Haynes and Jackson Meeks from Georgia that have helped out, brought in Fadil Diggs, defensive end out of Texas A&M. This is the most talented Syracuse has been since probably Donovan McNabb was taking snaps back in the 90s. I mean, it's just different right now in upstate New York. And then I'd say Kalen DeBoer would have been in this conversation when it was 28-0 against Georgia. Unfortunately, they've had a rocky last 6 quarters of football. Yeah. He also inherited probably the best case scenario. Yeah. I mean, it's not easy to step in for the legend, Nick Saban, but roster-wise, resource-wise,
it's Alabama.
It's Alabama. Yeah. Still a phenomenal coach. Alabama's going to have great success under Kalen DeBoer.
You mentioned the Roll Tide, and I think that's very fitting that our next award is the game of the year so far. Which game have you got the popcorn out, most exciting through weeks 1 through 6?
Yeah, I think it's Alabama-Georgia, and I don't think there's any doubt about that. We were down in Miami.
I was going to say, where did we watch the end of that game?
Well, we were getting some ice cream, and we were on the way to the ice cream shop. We watched the whole first half after dinner at the house, and then we go out for ice cream. We're watching it locked in the line at ice cream. We're yelling, just a bonkers football game between Alabama and Georgia. Ryan Williams showed that he's a dog. I mean, it was just a lot of fun. I think Vanderbilt, Alabama has something to say
Yeah.
about that? You know, that big one. There's some others, no doubt.
I just want to say, when Ryan Williams made that crazy touchdown, right, the first play after Georgia went and took the lead, that was when we were watching on the phone in the backseat of the car, and we're like grabbing each other, screaming like this, and our two friends in the front seat are like, what the heck is going on back there? And we're just like, man, I love college football so much.
They were like, we got two play-by-play guys in the back, because me and Kyle are sitting there, Raza's in between us, and they're like, we got two play-by-play guys back there, and you're just screaming like little girls. No one could deliver us what happened.
I think Alabama, Georgia is like definitely the answer, but I'm gonna point you guys in a different direction. In week 4, right, it was Friday night. Syracuse had just lost to Stanford, and you flip the channel to I think it's True TV, where the Mountain West and the Pac-12 are playing football now. Washington State beat San Jose State 54-52 in double overtime. Crazy game where Washington State or San Jose State, when it took the lead at the end of the game on a 4th and goal, and then Washington State goes and forces overtime, and both teams trade interceptions in the first overtime, and then Washington State goes and wins it in the second. It was an awesome game. I would just suggest to everybody go watch the highlights if you have no idea what I'm talking about, and prepare to be amazed and be, maybe a bit sorrowful that you did not stay up until 3 a.m. to watch that game, because it was awesome.
Well, it sounds like it's staying at that late for a good game at least pays off. And now for our final award of the show. We talked about the game of the year, but how about the game to watch on the horizon in the second half of the season? What's that one game you have circled on the calendar?
I think you could make the argument that it's tomorrow night, Ohio State at Oregon. First AP top 3 matchup of the year, right? Because Alabama, Georgia was 2 versus 4. But I'm going to go back to the SEC, and I'm going to go Georgia at Texas on October 19th. For much of the year, we thought maybe that was going to be a 1 versus 2 matchup. It could still be an SEC title game preview, and I think it's a great spot next week for, Georgia to try and come back and say, like, hey, listen, we did lose to Alabama, we did struggle with Tennessee, but we're still Georgia. We still run this conference. But Texas could say, hey, we've got something to say about that. We're the #1 team in the country, and we're in our first year in the SEC, but we're out to prove that we're the big dogs. I think that's going to be a game with a ton of awesome storylines, and I'm really excited to watch it next week.
And Quinn Ewers back this week for the
That's
Red
right.
River rivalry against Oklahoma as well. I'm going to go, first of all, I agree with you, no doubt, and I can't wait to watch both of those games. I think Alabama-Tennessee has some juice to it still. I know the Vols got upset and Alabama got upset last week. That definitely dampers things,
Right.
puts a little bit of water on the fire, so to speak. But I think that's still got some juice to it. And here's a shout for you. Penn State, Ohio State.
Yeah.
I think is a huge game that is not being talked enough about. I think for Ohio State, because Michigan has not, lived up to the national championship level that they had last season,
Right.
That's very natural. You lose your quarterback, lose a lot of your roster, and you lose your head coach to the NFL and Jim Harbaugh, plus some of the drama and everything going on around the program and with the NCAA. I think for Ohio State, the Michigan game this year, it's still a huge game. No disrespect to the greatest rivalry in the sport, but I think it's Penn State and Oregon. As far as we need to get up, we need to win this game, and to assert yourself as the best team in the Big Ten, you have to be Penn State and Oregon this year, and that Penn State game's huge.
Yeah, and to kind of back up that point, Ohio State gets Michigan in Columbus at the end of this year. But this weekend, they have to go to Autzen. And then in a few weeks, they have to go to Happy Valley, 2 of the most difficult places to play, not just in the Big Ten, but in the country. And Ohio State sometimes can be susceptible on the road. So if they're going to be, this championship or bust team that we all know that they can be and should be, those are going to be their 2 biggest games on the schedule. So I'm very excited to watch it all play out.
Who doesn't love a good Big Ten rivalry, especially with the new additions they have? It's one of the deepest conferences in the country. But that's going to do it for us here at the Moss Arts Center. And this has been another edition of the 3304 Sports Kickoff Show, the bye-week edition for our reporters, Kyle Marchak and Key McCrimmon, my panelists, Raza Umerani and Giovanni. I've been Braden Schenck saying so long from Moss Arts Center, and we'll see you next week back on the Kickoff Show.